Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to dedicate this talk to Maureen. I only heard about Maureen this morning from Steph in our group. Maureen was a disabled woman who lived in Chesterfield and got left behind in the floods and drowned. And in a way, this talk is dedicated to the idea that there should be no more deaths like Maureen's death. It's actually a very practical proposal that I'm here to make, but I want to ground it in theory. That might just be because I'm a nerd and I love theory, but there's a strength here that I feel of understanding where we are and how we might get through the times that we're in. So the part one is going to be a rapid tramp through some materials that ground the proposed actions in part two. And I'm really glad, actually, to learn just today that Dr. Luke Kemp from the Centre for Studies of Existential Risk at Cambridge University is launching a new book called Goliath's Curse that seems like the long-form version of at least something of the talk that you're getting today. So we know what's coming. We can predict quite a bit of it. There are maps telling us about where the wet bulb temperatures are going to come, where the risks of floods and droughts are from probable futures and others. But obviously in the UK, we can't be totally sure about it because of this unknown quantity of the AMOC collapse. There's a scientific debate about how that might go. So for the UK in particular, it leaves some uncertainty. But one estimate suggests that arable land usage will drop down to 7%. And that's a conservative estimate, apparently. So according to Professor Bendell, we've been in the early stages of civilisational collapse since 2015, if we look at human development indexes and the quality of life indexes. And many of us will already feel that we're in it. 8 in 10 Britons think that public services have got worse in the last 5 years. That's a sign, right? And Britain's local governments are at serious risk of widespread collapse. And this is underpinned, of course, by a depth and growing inequality. And I'm glad for the work of, give my menopausal brain a help, Gary Stevenson, in bringing inequality to life in such a vivid way at this time. Very helpful work. And of course, these times are characterised by networked sociopathic corporations. Julia Steinberg made a very brilliant summary recently about the networking behind the scenes, the active organisation of the neoliberal takeover and the destruction of the so-called democracy that we had, and how that's leading to the rise of the far right, has been talked about a lot already, based in rising poverty, scapegoating, divide and rule, and predictably with a whole host of horrendous agendas. Reform had 14% vote share. But I think, as David Adler said, it's important to note we need to completely rethink what fascism is and how we fight it. The main fascist threat we're facing today isn't the far-right parties, but the civilisational fascist turn of Western centrists. And most obvious in European countries with our complicity with the genocide in Gaza. And underpinned, of course, by this onslaught in the media that's deliberate. Very often, Steve Bannon says, political parties don't matter. The real opposition is in the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. Quite deliberate. 2 points. One, to create doubt and mistrust in public institutions, and the other to create confusion. So look, that's where we are. I think I doubt many of us disagree on that. But why are we here? If we're going to decide what to do, why are we here? And there are ways of thinking about things from different perspectives. And I think if you only think from one perspective, you miss the point. So we can think as ants at ground level. What can we see? What's right in front of our noses? What's happening on the ground? We can think like eagles, the greater perspective. We see things in their cultural and historic context, in their economic context. And we can see things as angels. We can go to the wider unfolding of the greater mystery of life, consciousness, the universe, spirituality, and all that science is telling us about those things these days. So the ant, the eagle, and the angel And when we go to questions and answers, I've got the first question for you. I want you to tell me to think about reform from the perspective of an ant, an eagle, and an angel. Because otherwise we won't figure out what to do. So when we ask why we're in a mess, it's important to never be satisfied with the answer. Keep asking why. And there's the concept of the 5 whys. You keep digging into the layers. You ask why have we got this? Well, it's bad policy. There's bad policy. And then if we're not careful, we spend a lot of time fighting policy. Well, why do such stupid policies get to be there? Well, there's a growth-based economic system that supplies money to the people who are pushing for these policies. Well, do we just stay there and say it's all capitalism's fault, you know? Of course it is. And this has been going on for longer than capitalism. Humans have been on the planet for 200,000 to 300,000 years. This is a 5,000 to 10,000-year-old problem. It's a domination and control system. It's a system that's based on the idea of domination and control and the success-to-success mechanisms that are baked in. You dominate and control, and you get more resources that help you to dominate and control. OK, so how can they get away with that? Why don't we just stop them? It's only a few people. It's the dark triad. It's the sociopaths, the narcissists, and the Machiavellians. Why don't we just stop them? Divide and rule and co-option. They pull us into their ways, and they divide us. Like, well, why are we letting them get away with that? What's happening? They hijack our nervous systems. So we're people who are traumatized on a daily basis, and it's become so normal we don't recognize it. We tend to focus on those first 2 points, but we have actual agency in the bottom 2. And where are we at with those 2? So human beings, when bad things happen, we go into these 5 states: fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or flop. And we recover, and then we get back into our intelligence and our compassion, if we have a way to recover. But what happens when the traumatization carries on and it gets passed on epigenetically and down the generations? We get frozen into states of being. It'll depend a little bit on your specific circumstances and personality, and demographics, and so on. I wonder if you know yours. What are the things that you tend to go into, you know, when you're stressed particularly? And what's the state that you're in a lot of the time? Human beings need to feel safety, freedom, and belonging. But those human needs become a strategy and a delusion when they get hardwired into a traumatized state. And then it becomes a collectivized trauma in so-called civilization. We shouldn't think of this as civilization. We're caged animals. And when caged animals do pacing and they fight each other, that's what we're like. That's what we're in. And we really do need to understand this trauma. And as I've understood it when I've worked with people racialised as black and brown, they're asking, especially those of us racialised as white, to look at the trauma that we've not fully faced or hardly ever faced or hardly at all faced, what it meant to be severed from our land, the manifold colonisation that happened here, the lack of rites of passage, the lack of ways to help us to grow up. I have to say, as a woman, you get a little bit of that built into your body, menopause again, but and birthing children and bleeding. But we need these rites of passage to be held well. The lack of healthy holding of a regenerative culture, this inability to be free, to be creative, to bring our own particular gifts, to know that your basic needs will be met. I mean, what does it mean to live in a society where you're fearful of your basic needs, but you're not even conscious of that every day, unless you're really on the breadline? It doesn't mean you're not having your basic needs met. And there's a lack of welcome. I did Vision Quest this year. I sat on the land of Dartmoor, supported by the path that I'm on for 4 days and nights without food and water, which was, of course, some sort of a beautiful ordeal. And there was a lot of support. And it was a bit of a miracle, actually. People were drinking for me at home. And I felt a little bit thirsty and a bit fearful one time. And a gust of breeze happened, and it quenched my thirst. I was like, I don't know, it's beyond my mind how that happened. But the thing that was most surprising was when I walked back into the village that had been holding the space, the welcome, the welcome, the beauty of the welcome. And they say that we're in our essence because the parts can't be online, the masks can't be online when you've not drank and eaten for so long. And we look so beautiful, and they welcome you in this beautiful way. And I felt such a profound welcome back into the family of life and into community and into the land that I've never experienced. That's our birthright. And actually, my colleague and sister, Skina Rathor-Kashmiri, she was helping us write some new dedications, some new principles, and she put welcome at the centre, and I didn't really understand it. I thought you get a cup of tea in Yorkshire. There's something very profound about welcome. And so we were actually living in this pathology. It's understood now neurophysiologically, you know, Ian McGilchrist's work, the hemisphere hypothesis, and it's talked about in cultures. You may have heard me talk about this before, Wetiko, Windingo, the Rakshasas in Hinduism, the hungry ghost in Buddhism. It's an insatiable appetite, and it gets systematized. And it's coming to a head in this meta-crisis, in this time of collapse. Because what healthy cultures do is that they mitigate for Wetiko. And what our culture, so-called culture, does is to promote it, celebrate it, support it, encourage it, co-opt it. So this, what I'm talking about, is fundamentally about building cultures. And in XR, regenerative cultures was the thing that got sidelined and seen as a sort of nice add-on. Somebody giving you a bottle of water when you're in a lock-on. No, it needs to be centred, the building of cultures, community by community, and even in your own body. Right? Cultures that can overcome divide and rule, and co-option by design. Because as Pat McCabe said, you know, we have low self-esteem right now as a species because we've come to think that everything we touch we destroy, and it's not so. It's not inherent in our nature. It's because we've living in a certain paradigm. We need to move past that paradigm. So we go back to this 5 whys, and we look at the bottom 2, and we think, OK, we can do something about these 2. We need to think well about that, and there's proposals here. And what they do is they're underpinning a system. And if we're going to talk about making change, we really have to understand systems. We can see even our nervous system as a fractal within the domination and control system. So I'm not going to do a lecture on systems, obviously, but you'll know something about it. You know, there's climate systems, there's nervous systems, there's food systems, there's the finance system. They all have the same underlying principles. There's feedback loops. There's emergent properties when over time, and there are tipping points. I think Tim Lenton was just speaking to some of those. They can adapt and change, but the underlying form remains until they fall to pieces. And so Jennifer Hinton's work, you can't see this properly, but it shows what happens in this system, how environmental destruction's baked in. So in this complex adaptive anti-life system, it's based on these simple rules. It's based on separation, domination and control, and that money's created as a debt. And if we try to beat this system using the mechanisms in the system, we'll fail because we're just joining the arms race, and I'm just not as nasty as some of the others, you know. We have to tap into deeper powers. We have to tap into a different system. I really love Josh Schrei's podcast, The Emerald. Have you listened to that? The Emerald. There's one on power at the minute, and he's talking about the obvious power of Musk and Trump. That's the obvious power. And there's the power in the animate world, the power of time, for example. And corny as it is to say it, the power of love. So we know that from Donella Meadows' work that, you know, there are ways to impact a system. We have to look for leverage points. And there is a big leverage point, actually, that is already starting to disable the global finance system, which is to do with the appropriation, extraction, colonisation in the global south. It's huge. Of course, we all know this. Well, I hope we do now, that our civilization, so-called, is built on this extraction. But there is a big saying of no in the global south. I've spoken about this last year, about the Alliance for Sahel States. I went to visit West Africa last year. It means a big deal when people in Burkina Faso are starting to repudiate colonial debt, when they're starting to talk about creating their own currency, Jason Hickel and Ndongo Samba Sayala have talked about unilateral decolonisation. It's starting to happen. So there's power in the global south. Are we paying attention to that, and how are we in support? So in a way, the part of the point of saying that, it's not all on us, right? But what we do have to do is build a new paradigm as something falls to pieces. And that means some very specific interventions. From a systems theory perspective, we're currently in a very weak position. The finance system is a house of cards built on sand. Climate system, we're in tipping point land. The food system, George Monbiot talks about this in Regenerative. It relies on both of the above, and it's also weak in itself. And those things underpin a collapse. And collapse, from a systems point, is a systemic thing. When collapse happens, it often does one of two things. It goes into chaos, or it goes into a sort of worse state. And has anybody seen the film 2073? It's kind of it's a way of sort of showing you where we're heading into the worst state. You know, it's sort of AI-enabled surveillance and control, gated communities for a few, and so on. And the domination and control paradigm is working on a set of philosophies, I'm not going to get into the detail about this, called Tescrial, to justify a mass death. I've written about this on my blog on Buy Me a Coffee about AI. And one way of saying it, and I think it's important to really know this, is all that's really happening at the minute is the reveal, as my friend Sari would call it. Revealing what always was in this domination and control system. It's a fascist project. It's been sugar-coated for some of us in the global north, especially for us, from some of us in living with certain demographics. And that sugar-coating's going. And we're getting what other people have had for a long time. So that's where we really, really need to get solidarity. Okay. So let's breathe. There's the somatics, there's the body. There's something in all of this about being choiceful about our attention. There's some way in which, there's bearing witness matters. And the way, at least I'm feeling it, it's like there's some rubble, the crumbling, and there's the cracks of the light, and I look at bits of the rubble and I'm like, keep looking at the light. There's a line through. There's a through line through to a new paradigm. And part of it, the first thing to do is to get control of your own nervous system and to understand your own ways of recovery. In the path I sit with, we can go into a keening form of grief. Go into it, and then let they talk about hoocher, the negative energies, let the earth have it back, and then we move on. Actually, when I was in ceremony after the April 2019 rebellion in the December solstice, I had such a big, it felt like a very big message from life, saying, enough of the misery. Life wants to be lived. Like, life really wants you to live. It wants you to enjoy. And there's a joy that comes from being purposeful. It's not happiness. It's not indulgent. Of course, there's misery and there's difficulty, and that's all part of it. But there's a Spinozan joy, it's called. Spinozan joy by feeling purposeful and clear about what's yours to do. And that's a really important thing to find, what's yours to do. This is actually the person who leads the path that I'm with. And he said, there will come a time when the people are on their knees and they're going to look around to see who can stand tall. And so what are we going to do to be ready? Well, a little bit more nerdery. You may have come across the Bacana two-loop model. As something's collapsing, there are things that we can transition over to the new system. I think the groundswell of trying out the new democracy is versions of that, for example. There are things we have to help to die. It flashed up on one of the slides, that brilliant book, Hospice in Modernity by Vanessa Mercado de Oliveira. How do we hospice the systems of modernity, both in ourselves and in the groups that we operate in? And the other thing is that there are people that are of the new paradigm already, are living some aspects of it, are, at the second horizon, if you know that framing. Lots of it here, right, at Green Gathering. And we have to create connections between those bits of emergence, between the new things that are emerging and let it emerge into something more complex. So I've been talking to my friend Sarah a lot about the new Corbyn party. It's just from this perspective, right? If it's elected, can it create a new system? I don't think so. I could say why I don't think so. So I wouldn't be throwing myself into that personally because I know it can't do something bigger that's needed. However, it can, if it really works locally, as Momentum did before, it can strengthen local work. It could be really, really important to get shit organised locally with that party. And if it continues to enhance work to promote assemblies, that would be really helpful. So you don't always have to see things from an ant level. Oh, is it going to work? What else might it be doing? The Cynefin Centre, they talk about, if you want to deal with polarities, you don't get people to sit together and talk about their polarities. Doesn't really work. Go and do something difficult together. Yeah, work together. Well, we're going to have to work together as things fall to pieces. It's all lining up for us to get to do a new direction. So we need to be ready. Okay, so there's this brilliant polymath called Daniel Schmachtenberger who talks about systemic collapse and talks about the third attractor. So I've already said things can go into chaos and they can go into a worse state and some combination of the two. If you think about a sort of more or less level surface with some slopes and the balls on the surface, they might go into the chaos bit, they might go into the new state. There's another state over here. It's called a third attractor, a third state that we might go in. We could nudge the balls in that direction. What is this third attractor? Important to know. So Schmachtenberger has put together some criteria. First of all, he said it needs to prevent human catastrophe. Well, he's fucked on that one. It's not prevented, but we can mitigate for it. We can do our best to mitigate for it and catch it and work through it. Coherent, decentralised choice-making is really important. The intelligence of many, but with speed, so there needs to be lots of connections being made. And we have to be able to act as individuals, but in service to the collective. So, when you're organising a social movement, the general gist is there's about 10 different jobs to do, and it's to get people arrested, right? Well, that was the XR thing, and JSO and so on. But with this, there's so many more things that are needed, so many more things that are going to be needed. This third attractor has to work across infrastructure, social structure, and superstructure. And if you look at it, if you're doing anything half decent in the world, you'll find your work in this third attractor. Whether it's about the water, the food, energy, transport, the infrastructure, or the social structure, institutions, how we're making decisions together, how we're going to process grief, how we're going to coordinate, and the superstructure, what shared values are we in, the culture, the spirituality. I was thinking about this earlier. Imagine if we had to stay here in Green Gathering for a year and we only had 3 months of food. What would we do? Because we've got so many of the people here that would be needed. But we'd have to get that collective capacity together and get organised. There'd be a lot to tend. OK, look, so things are getting shit and they're going to get shitter. The systems of this so-called civilisation are in collapse. But the underlying drivers will remain. They just won't have quite as much power, I don't think. And we have to focus on organising towards this third attractor. It's called a collective agent. When it's happening, lots of people are operating in a way that feels like a body, like a murmuration. That's what it feels like, what it looks like. And you wouldn't necessarily even know that what you're doing is aligning and supporting what somebody else is doing. This is how it's working on the reactionary right at the minute. You've got weirdness like the manosphere alongside the sort of tech bro Elon Musk, Silicon Valley stuff, alongside the sort of narcissist, alongside the Christian fundamentalist. They're not aligned. But as a collective, working within a system that suits them, they're able to do something right. It's called a collective agent. We're going to make that collective agent together. We've already started. So here's the work. So the thing that fascinates me then is well, what's next to do? What's next to do? If you're already focused on a particular thing, carry on, right? But there's a particular pieces of work that are needed to create this through line. That's as far as I can tell. And this is the work that I've been doing with a group of us under this heading of Lifehouse Collapse Preparing Communities. It doesn't need you all to join, and you're welcome, just to say. It's not so much about that, it's understanding what we're trying to do. And what life does is it makes forms, it finds forms, and when forms work for life, they replicate. And there's some forms that I'm trying to say to you that we need to find, right? And actually what it's also about is bringing together activist energy. You know what we like to get shit done and get stuff organised, it's good. But you also have in communities a very service-orientated energy that's always been willing just to do what was needed because people are suffering now. And then you have people that are like, you know, they're not the kind of guy you want to really hang out with and have a conversation about trans rights, but he's probably going to show up with his 4x4 and be a decent human being in the flood, right? And maybe eventually we'll have that conversation when we've got relationship with him. You see what I'm saying? There's a body of people to come together. And I think what's really important in this is that basic human values are anti-fascist. Basic human values of that we care for each other, that people's needs should be met, and that people should have a voice, right? So we don't have to be all fancy hippie about this. I mean, I like to do that, but in our communities, we can be quite straight about this, and it's normal behaviour. So we're not doing that. I'm not talking about surviving. I'm not, personally, if we were just talking about surviving, I wouldn't be that excited about this. I'd be like, well, whatevs. I'd be just go and have a nice time and hang out with my kids and whatever. But I can see the possibility of seeds of transformation, you know? And in a way, I don't think our generation's going to know whether this works or not. So, like, we just got to fucking try, right? And we need to, you know, if you've been in despair or in grief or in uncertainty, it's time to process those feelings and get some focus back. I think our movements have felt a little bit scattered and we've moved into different things, different work, and it's time to come back together in a particular way. So that's why I said it's from tea bags in our community to sandbags to paradigm shift. So there's 3 areas of focus that I'm thinking about. One is that we've got to think about a design at a very micro neighbourhood level and build upwards from that. How are we going to get organised with our very nearest neighbours? What kinds of mechanisms are we going to use? How are we going to be together? We don't have to invent this stuff. People have been thinking about this for a while and trying things, you know, like transition streets or whatever. There's lots out there to build from. We've got to bring networks and organisations together. But it's a very simple thing that people often say, we need to collaborate. Like, what does that mean? How do we do that? We're always in silos, but what does that practically require? And then if we get something set up, we need to start coming together around these designs, I think. So, dear old Toby and Joe in the team are working with others on this neighbourhood design. It's a work in progress. I'm just going to give you a little scoot through it. There are sort of layers that will need to be organised and come together over time, and this is a particular intervention at a community level. And the purpose really is to build life-affirming regenerative cultures from neighbourhoods upwards, using mechanisms to build power, to build resilience, and to build togetherness. And in particular, some of us will be bearing in mind this third attractor and all that it implies. So this needs to allow for iterations and review and feedback. And there are certain things that we're aiming to do, a number of overarching aims that sort of feed this purpose. There's something about how we want to build. We're building and strengthening networks locally. We're going to understand what's already there in the community and voluntary sector. We're going to build teams that are really functional. In Lifehouse ourselves as an organising group, we spent quite a lot of time thinking about how we want to organise well together. Because it's not just the what, it's the how. It's the how that's as much. Because that's where the divide and rule shows up and the hijacking of the nervous system. So the how is a really big deal. And then as we take action in our communities, what we're trying to do is find ways for having agency together. So to scoot through somewhat quickly, there's some people that come together in a startup phase and start to just get to know the local landscape, start to decide how they're going to organise together. It would be really helpful if some of these organisers, our elders in the room, John Porritt, our elders in the room, we need some of our best young organisers to have housing in communities so they can get on with work, right? And there are common models. There is post-capitalist infrastructure. There are cooperative models we use. We need some help with people who've got money in ISAs and all the rest of it. There's some new economic models for that. Anyway, it's a detail, but it's important. When you're trying to regenerate together, you look at your pioneer species and young activists with a lot of energy, they need a fucking roof over their heads, right? They need that taken off their backs. So these facilitators start building up teams. There's certain jobs that have... I'm not getting into all the detail of this because you can see there's detail in it, but part of the point really is how do we bring these different energies together across communities? We need to meet people who are already active in communities. We need to go and talk to people. We need to sort of start building teams that can... that are already in some leadership in the community and start to think together. So for each one of these aspects of this design, there'll be some materials that people can use, so they can get on with it and tell us whether they're good enough and whether they worked or not, right? We get to one stage where you start to think where you live, that micro level, and we'll look at getting some technology together, some different ones out there that we're examining at the minute, and start to think about knocking on the doors of our neighbours and how to have that conversation. Obviously, looking at Climate Psychology Alliance lady here, we're not going to be going, oh, the world's going to collapse, right? There are different ways that we need to speak with different people, and that's something that we need to get really, really good at. Those cool guys up in Birmingham, what are they called, Tobe? Imikawa's law. Civic Square. Do you know, the people have already been finding this form, we've got people to learn from. And when we're in that neighbourhood level, we'll be looking at what assets are already there, and we'll be looking at maybe we meet together in the pub and we start to get to know each other, start to audit where are our moorings, where are our vulnerable disabled people in our community, where are people with skills. You've got to find the capacity. This is not just about going to the community and voluntary sector who are already on their knees and asking them to do more. It's actually asking them what they need and trying to filter people in. So we might door knock and we might ask people if they get this, have they got 4 hours spare a month to put into their community? Something like that, right? We might join parish councils, the flat pack approach, because there'll be some way to access resources that way. I think there's a bit of power in parish councils that are going to be useful for this. I won't go near a district council myself. It's just managing decline. These neighbourhoods come together, and what we're trying to do is build stand-in citizens' assemblies. And so by standing, we're building the new democracy. It's the Buckminster Fuller moment. We're building the new democracy. And so those assemblies, what they're doing is they're asking a question where the people have agency. We're not saying, oh, what kind of economic system would we all love to have, discuss. We're saying, what will we do? What can we do to think about it when there isn't food in the supermarkets for a month or when the next pandemic happens? We're asking questions where we have to find the answer. There are local resilience forums in the statutory sector. We don't have to ignore them. We can see whether they can help, but we're not looking for the current system to save us. It's not gonna. In fact, the good news is they know they're fucked, and they're looking to us to do the work for them. And so there is some money out there for community resilience projects. It's just that we also need to build a new democracy and the paradigm shift within it. I'm not managing neoliberalism's decline. I'm not being the sticking plaster for them, Fuck it. So basically, now think about these assemblies, right? Think about these assemblies. When people are in a citizens' assembly, we've got to get this going now, soon. I don't mean to wind us up with urgency, but we've got to get going with it. Because when those assemblies have run for a while, first of all, it's going to look very boring. I mean, there's not going to be the glory of being carted off, getting arrested and feeling like a hero. It's boring work in a community, right? Making friends with your neighbours that are a bit annoying and starting an assembly that hardly anybody wants to come to. You know what I mean? It's going to take some time, but over time we'll be finding that form together. Think about it. We've got a strong land justice movement in this country, right? How does the land justice movement win its demand for the land back? When the people are hungry and they realise that the empty supermarket shelves are a feature, not a blip. we just are going to go and dig up their lawns, aren't we, and plant turnips. It's the peasants are coming back. The diggers are going to come back. We're going to do it. We need to be ready. We need to have just... We get together in the pub and we have a 3 acres and a cow show, if you know that show. We sing the songs of the diggers and all that, and we just do the education. And when people are ready, they'll make that decision. There's all sorts of power move decisions that could be made. We could decide in the bioregion, as these citizens' assemblies link up together in the bioregion, we could say, we're having our rights of nature back. So we've just decided that those chicken sheds are going to have to get shut down, you know? And the assembly decides it, right? But it's not going to come straight away, but we can visage it. You can imagine it. Oh, and so there are other things. We might bring housing back into the commons. We might decide that we're refusing conscription as a town because they'll come after our children for the wars, right? I mean, that's going to happen probably. We need to think about community safety and justice. So some of these assemblies could also be acting as justice bodies for justice. So there's a lot to think about, but there's a lot out there to draw from. A number of milestones, and obviously we sort of go into debriefing and learning and iterating in this design, right? So part of we're using this concept of Lifehouse from Adam Greenfield's book, and if you haven't read that book yet, I encourage you as a starting point to read that book. He was involved in Occupy Sandy. They managed to support 60,000 people to be self-organised to respond to a crisis, right? So what we'll be looking at is Lifehouses at the sort of postcode level, about 65 households. That's the Dunbar number. We might make some agreements about storing food, medicines, know where the vulnerable adults are, have these pub and dinner meetups and so on. So there'll be Lifehouses at that level. And then we're looking at sort of community asset spaces. We were talking about churches this afternoon and their potential role in that. Where we might need to store sandbags and water for purification. I learned this morning pet food's a big deal, actually. So, you know, we'll learn as crises hit us what we need in our life houses. Okay, so that's at the neighbourhood design level. The other thing is, of course, there are lots of skill sets, and thank God there are people doing solar kitchens and, you know, thinking about water and bioregion, stuff that I don't know about, people thinking about this stuff. Those networks are going to have to come together, the permaculture people, the grief tenders, etc. And how do we bring networks of networks together? How do we actually do that? It's a critical strategic intervention. And we haven't been managing it. This was it just makes me laugh, this somehow. It was an artist on a window. You'll never defeat us, for we've already defeated ourselves. That's the progressive left. And, you know, speaking to the, I don't get into this detail, but Navigate, Paul Kawati and Amma Crow did a sort of analysis of what tends to happen in our movements when we keep focusing at the top end of those 5 whys on policy, cycles of disempowerment and burnout, right? So what does it take to come together? How do we create the conditions for emergence? And this is where I'll go back to what I was saying earlier. You know, there's an anti-life system that got unleashed through trauma. But there's a life system that already exists. And life is an intelligence. It grows more complexity and diversity and beauty. And we can turn towards that life system and remember that that is the complex system that we're part of. That's what we belong to, this life-affirming system. You know, it's got this cool stuff it gets up to, fractality. That's where the neighbourhood design's important. We create fractals of organising. And then those fractals come together and emergence is possible. And it's this thing about life finding the form, right? We've got to find the time to find the form. If it's not working, we've got to go back and work out what wasn't working. And what could potentially emerge, you know? And I'm not skipping over AMOC collapse and the shit show that we're going to go in, right? But with a domination and control system, the resistance, by the way, is absolutely essential to this. It's not all about food production. There's part of it is how do we resist the harm that's going to come at our way as well, right? So there's a thought that we've been having with Being the Change for some time of a global immune response, because healthy regenerative cultures in indigenous cultures, they could take care of wet eco, they could take care of trauma and sociopaths. They had cultural ways of doing that, but they didn't have things in place particularly for when somebody else came from somewhere else with the guns and the germs and the, and the domination. And so Gaia is now needing a global immune response to be figured out. And I personally feel like a lot of that's happening around the response to Palestine, to what's happening in the genocide. And how we find the connection and how we find the through line for power to say no is really important. And of course, it's also about repair and building new ways. Well, it turns out, life needs things to flow. And so there's a need to design a network of networks based in 7 living systems. This is based in Miki Kashtan's work, and again, referring back to Navigate. You have to think about how information flows around a system. You have to think about how resources flow, how we engage with conflict, how care and support happens, how we tend to connection and community, how feedback happens within that system, and how decision-making happens. All those things need to be thought about. And so after Green Gathering, I'm going to be with a group of people where we're going to sit together for a few days and think about this design in more detail. And some of the guys are from organising from elsewhere, and they've put forward this particular framework. This is what happens in systems, right? In systems, the simple rules keep perpetuating the system. So if we're going to build a new paradigm, we have to know what our simple rules are that we commit to working with. And organising from elsewhere are proposing that we make a commitment that whenever there's a decision to be made, we choose the option that cultivates both our awareness of and embodied experience of interconnectedness, that we centre interconnectedness, and that we're also going to reflect on, well, how did that go? What is there something that we're needing to learn? Is there something we need to do differently? And then making space for learning to happen. It's not always rushing to the doing. It's like, how are we doing this? Is this working for us? And it's a titration. It's small steps in a direction. Thank you. I'm at the end. So, I haven't quite. Yeah. So, I'm going to read this list out. It's just from Martin Winiecki, and there's something to really know about what we're in right now. Actually, maybe we will, because I think it's a brilliant list. Martin Winiecki from Timera. I'm looking for people who get these things, like accepting and preparing for societal collapse, actively disinvesting from capitalist and colonialist violence, the necessary work of dismantling systems of oppression and hospice in modernity, including in the body, effective solidarity with anti-colonial and anti-oppressive struggles, fighting fascism with firmness and also emotional kindness towards individuals in our communities, right? Preserving and regenerating ecosystems, building post-capitalist infrastructure, creating webs of local support in care, culture and community. Fancy words meaning the ways of being and knowing that shifted towards alignment with nature, what I just told you about organising from elsewhere. And places where this all comes together, and that could be in your community, and there are small steps to take. So if you're interested in what I've been saying, there's a blog on Buy Me a Coffee, you don't have to buy me a coffee, called So Now What, that explains some of this again, and gives you a link to yet another WhatsApp chat, just for now, while we get organised. I guess I just want us all to know that this is a time that we're meant to be here. If you're here, as Chiokas in Ghost Horse said, you're here for a reason. And there's a through line. There's a line through with this third attractor, with thinking about the criteria. There's a way to move through, to build a new democracy. It's hard work in our communities, and we could come together at Green Gathering and let our hair down and learn some shit together. So, from tea bags to sandbags to paradigm shift. Thank you.